For the next edition of It's About Money, my guest will be Charlie Owens, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. Hope you stay tuned. Hello and welcome to another edition of It's About Money. I'm Nannette Nocon and thank you for joining us. Today we have a great program. My guest is Charlie Owens, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. Thanks for being here, Charlie.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
So people talk about the R.P.O. What is the R.P.O.? It's a very basic question, but help me share with our audience.
Well, the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, or R.P.O. as we're commonly known, is a professional orchestra located right here in Rochester, New York. We were founded 88 years ago by George Eastman, who's we're just one of the many legacies that George Eastman left in this community. He founded the Eastman School of Music, built the Eastman Theater, and created the R.P.O. and its predecessor organizations all at the same time in 1922. So for 88 years we've been providing this community with really world-class entertainment, education programs for the people of the Rochester region.
Now, what is the most important aspect of your role as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Philharmonic?
That's a good question. I mean, there are certain days when it feels like a kind of chief cook and bottle washer type position because it's a very busy organization. We present more than 200 concerts and education programs in a typical year. But like many nonprofit organizations, we've got a very lean, very talented, very hardworking and dedicated, but a very lean staff. So I think when people come to a concert, they often don't fully appreciate maybe all that goes into producing a concert. The concert production elements, the marketing, the fundraising, the financial management, the human resource aspect, contracts with our guest artists, contracts with our musicians. So it's a big job, but one that I've always felt was really a calling for me.
And you moved to Rochester from Connecticut?
That's right. I've just started my 4th season with the R.P.O. A few weeks ago, after 15 years in Hartford, Connecticut, where I was affiliated at various times both with the Hartford Symphony Orchestra and the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art.
I see. Very nice. We're very pleased that you're here in Rochester with the Philharmonic.
Thank you. I am too.
Now, share a brief history of the R.P.O. It was founded by George Eastman, and there's been some transformation over the years, and in the recent past, there's a change in the venue, in the look of the venue. So tell us a little bit more about the history of the Philharmonic.
So as I said, yeah, in 1922, George Eastman really created an artistic, cultural, and business model, a 3-part model, where there was a music school, a professional orchestra, and a terrific venue. And he didn't do anything lightly. He wanted to start, or incrementally even. He wanted from day one this to be a full-fledged professional orchestra. He wanted a top-flight faculty at the Eastman School. So literally from day one, you had Eastman faculty, many of whom he or his managers had recruited from Europe. We had an influx of Russian, German, Italian emigres coming here, so that from day one there was a major music school, and of course many of their faculty performed with us from the early years. As I always say, the world's great orchestras perform in the world's great concert halls. There's something about the acoustical environment where the orchestra rehearses every day and where it performs, that where the distinctive sound of an orchestra is really a reflection not only of the players on stage, but its acoustical environment. So we were privileged, again, literally from day one, 88 years ago, to play in a first-rate venue. Although it's important to note that that venue and its architecture were not originally created for their acoustical properties, but for the ability to maximize the number of people who are coming to the hall, primarily for motion pictures. George Eastman was a businessman at the not just at the end of the day, but all day, every day, and so it was important to him to showcase motion pictures, which was a business and an art form in its infancy at that time. So, fast forward to the recent renovations, where we took the kind of fan-shaped hall that of more than 3,100 seats, which actually made it the second largest concert hall for a major orchestra in all of the United States.
Oh, goodness.
And downsized it to about 2,300 seats in the recent renovation. And I'm moving my hands in this way because we went from this kind of fan shape to the narrower shape with the introduction of box seats that are really tucked around giant acoustical panels. So we've reduced the size of the orchestra. We've also tightened up the acoustics by narrowing the width of the orchestra, and we've gone, as the saying goes, from good to great. We've gone from a good acoustic to, I think, a really fine acoustic.
That's great. And then recently there's been the addition of the cafe, and then there's a new wing that's going to be opening. That's
right. The week of December 6th, 2010 is the grand opening of the new wing, which it's built on a former parking lot. Actually, when George Eastman built the Eastman Theater, there was an apartment building on the corner of Swan Street and Main Street. And the owner of that building wanted a high price when he figured out that it was George Eastman who was looking to buy his property. The owner of that apartment building thought he could extort a pretty large price. Sure. George Eastman was not going to pay more than reasonable market value for it, so he built the theater around it, which accounts for its kind of odd shape and the fact that the axis of the theater is twisted. You come in the oval lobby and you actually have to turn almost a 45-degree angle to the right. That was in order to shoehorn that the theater on a kind of odd-shaped, trapezoidal parcel. So. With the theater built right up against that apartment building I'm sure became less desirable, and it was eventually torn down. And for much of the last century, it was a parking lot. But so here we're opening this magnificent expansion of the theater complex and the Eastman School with a beautiful new recital hall, an enormous rehearsal hall, and for R.P.O. patrons, what we're most proud of are the new patron amenities that really bring us into take an early 20th century building and make it suitable for the 21st century.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. Now, the R.P.O. actually rents from the Eastman Theater, is that right?
That's right. I'm sure many people in this community who've grown up attending concerts or graduations at Eastman Theater may not fully appreciate who actually owns the building. So it's really owned by the University of Rochester, operated by the Eastman School of Music, a school of the University of Rochester. So the R.P.O. is a rent-paying tenant. Now, we're the biggest rent-paying tenant because we do at least 60 public performances there every year, probably at least a dozen school programs there in a year, and the hall itself is also our primary rehearsal venue. So the R.P.O. is using it a lot, but we're the tenant and they're the landlord.
And has it always been the home of the Philharmonic? Has it always been performing at the Eastman Theater?
Yes, literally from our very first concert.
I see. And then from time to time, the R.P.O. performs at other venues as well, correct?
That's right. Sometime in the last number of years, the beautiful church at Plymouth Avenue near Main Street, the Hochstein, is now known as the Hochstein School of Music and Dance. Their beautiful former sanctuary was repurposed a number of years ago in a beautiful renovation. So Hochstein is a very popular venue for us for our family programs on Sunday afternoons that we call Orchestra, and for our very popular, during the term of Christopher Seaman, very popular Symphony 101 series. While the Eastman Theater's been closed the last 3 summers for renovation, we've also been using the Hochstein space as a really terrific venue for our classical programming during the summer.
Yeah, great, that's wonderful. And then also perform at CMAC?
That's right. We have a long relationship with CMAC in Canandaigua. Many people in the audience, I'm sure, remember as the Finger Lakes Performing Arts Center. It was a vision of Marvin Sands and Constellation Brands to create a permanent summer home for the R.P.O. That began more than 30 years ago in an earlier iteration of the facility, which several years ago underwent a pretty dramatic transformation. But we continue a Saturday night series of concerts in the Canandaigua area every summer.
That's wonderful. And how big is the orchestra? I mean, it's different depending on the performance, right?
That's right. We're kind of two orchestras in one. We have what's called a core orchestra, which is really a kind of a vestige of one of George Eastman's creations, an enterprise called the Civic Music Association and the Rochester Civic Orchestra. It was very important to him not only to perform classical music at the highest level in a professional venue like the Eastman Theater, but it was important to him that we would get out into schools, into parks, into community centers. We really became a model for what I referred to recently as the American model for symphony orchestras, as opposed to the European model, which might be a little more for the elite and the cognoscenti of the community. It was important to George Eastman, and it's been important to our organization for all of these 88 years to be really an orchestra of the people that comes off of its pedestal from time to time and performs in city parks, at Ontario Beach, at Frontier Field. So it's that orchestra, that very versatile orchestra of just under 60 players. Those are the most full-time players of the R.P.O. They've got an annual contract of this year 37 weeks, more typically over the last 10 years or so 39 weeks of guaranteed employment during the year. Then those roughly 60 players are augmented for our classical programming on what we would consider our flagship classical series, the Philharmonic series. For those 14 weeks during the year, we augment that 60-piece orchestra with another 30 players to create that big, full, lush sound appropriate for the major masterworks of the classical literature. So if you're at Ontario Beach or Frontier Field or a Pops concert or one of the programs we do for children, any of our community concerts, that's typically the 57 to 60-piece core orchestra. You come to Kodak Hall at Eastman Theater on a Thursday or a Saturday for a classical concert, you'll see the full 87 members of the R.P.O.
And depending on whether it's the Philharmonic or the Pop series, it just changes in terms of its size. But you have the core, and then it just gets bigger with the Philharmonic. Right. How is the demographic different in terms, or is it at all different in terms of audience? I mean, do you get similar audience demographics, or is the Philharmonic more popular than the Pops? How is that attended? Well,
demographics, if you're looking at age and income levels and education levels, data like that, the Pops audience and the classical audience are almost indistinguishable. Mm-hmm. And in fact, here there is more crossover between audience among those two series or between those two series than is the case in most cities. I often tell this story that when I lived in Hartford, but during the time I was working not for the orchestra but for the art museum, I subscribed to a small series at the Boston Symphony, just to kind of experience how they operated. And in all the time that I did that, I never once got a brochure from the Boston Pops, which is the pop series of the Boston Symphony. It's the same players, for the most part, performing in the same space, beautiful symphony hall. But in that world, the Pops audience is over here, and the classical audience is over here, and there's very little crossover. In Rochester, what's happened, especially in the last 17 years that Jeff Tyzik has been our very popular Pops conductor and composer and arranger, I think he's elevated the Pop series to a point where even classical music lovers love to attend the Pops because in Jeff's Pops programming, he puts the focus on the orchestra itself. In many cities, the Pop series is a showcase for celebrity performers, and the orchestra is very much in a supportive, background role. But here, Jeff, for most of his concerts, put the orchestra very much center stage, often with his own arrangements. And I think for that reason we have more crossover. But and what's happened is, that demographically, the two series are are very similar.
And is there a larger audience for the Philharmonics versus the pop series, or is it about the same?
There's a slightly larger audience for the pop series.
I see. Okay. I was curious on that.
And I think that has changed over time, again, as Jeff has elevated the stature of that pop series.
That's happened. That's great. Terrific. Well, we'll take a quick break. My guest is Charlie Owens, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ben Affleck, and many actors have played the part of U.S. servicemen in the movies. But for veterans like James Crosby, their service and their sacrifice are real. And too often when they come home, their struggle continues. For over 60 years, Paralyzed Veterans of America has been fighting to help our injured veterans get the benefits they need and have earned.
Paralyzed Veterans of America was there for me when I came home.
Join me in supporting our paralyzed veterans. Visit pva.org.
Welcome back. I'm Nannette Nocon, and thanks for joining It's About Money. My guest is Charlie Owens, who is the CEO and President of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. Thanks again for being here, Charlie.
It's a great pleasure.
Let's talk about the money aspect of the Philharmonic. What is the budget of the R.P.O.?
Prior to the recession of 2008, our budget was slightly in excess of $10 million. Since then, as we've tried to bring our expenses into alignment with our revenues, we're just at about $9 million exactly.
Yes. And how does the R.P.O. raise its money? Obviously, there's ticket sales, but what other ways does the R.P.O. raise money?
I think many people will be surprised at how small the percentage of revenue from ticket sales actually is. At a typical concert, less than half the cost of producing that concert is actually covered by ticket sales. And if you take the totality of the organization in the course of a year, it's a little under 40% of our total revenues come from our box office. A little more than 50% come from the development office, various elements of fundraising, and then the last 10% through a draw on our endowment.
I see. So the orchestra is fortunate enough to have an endowment, but you need the contributions of donors, individual and corporate donors.
Yeah, so that 50% that comes from the development office, I would say, comes from the largest piece by far comes from individuals. In a typical year, even during the recession, approximately 6,000 families in the greater Rochester region support the R.P.O. above and beyond ticket sales with contributions to our annual fund. It's one of the largest, most robust annual fund programs of any orchestra in America. So we are still in the top 10, including all of the big cities and big city orchestras in terms of the number of families supporting the annual campaign. So that's by far the largest piece. Slightly more than $2 million comes from individuals. About $500,000 a year comes from corporations. Foundations and government each are about $400,000, and special events, opening night gala, the R.P.O. show house, events like that generate about $200,000 a year.
I see. We didn't talk about it earlier, but there's the Symphony Show House, which is a nice fundraiser for the Philharmonic as well, right?
That's right. For at least 10 years now, or maybe I guess it spans now 12 years, there have been 6 symphony show houses, sometimes in a beautiful historic property, the AAUW House on East Avenue, the Green Lantern Inn in Fairport, the Ellwanger Mansion on Mount Hope, and other times it's been a new build, often in partnership with Ketmar Development in Pittsford. So this past spring we had a very successful show house in Pittsford at 2 side-by-side cottages, a classics house and a pops house,
yes.
reflecting the 2 personalities of the R.P.O.
And so for those who are not familiar, the patrons pay an admission fee, which is what is raised. The money that is raised goes to the R.P.O.
Right. So these are homes where all of the interior spaces and often the exterior landscaping and patio and decks and terraces and so forth, all of those spaces have been designed by a local designer or landscaper, often at a very high level and in very imaginative ways. which people find fascinating to tour, whether it's a new home or a historic home. They just love to see the latest trends in
Sure.
in fabrics and green green appliances and all of those kinds of things. Now, the show houses are very labor intensive. It takes hundreds of volunteers, about 18 months in the preparation for. That's why they're every 2 years, because it's more than a year in the planning for for one of those. But for every other year for the last 12 years, that's been one of our major fundraisers. More recently, we're putting more and more emphasis on opening night at the Symphony, opening night at the R.P.O. We've been calling it the Red Carpet Spectacular, a way to not only raise money for the orchestra, but to raise awareness and visibility, making opening night at the Symphony a kind of one of the destination, highly anticipated events every year. Always with a red carpet walk where we close Gibbs Street, and the musicians and our guest artists, parade down the red carpet on their way to the stage, cheered on by our local fans. And
yes.
It has a kind of Oscar night quality to it.
Well, that's fantastic. So one of the things that most patrons, ticket buyers, probably don't realize is how their ticket is essentially funded, or part of it is funded by donations from individuals, corporations, foundations, and the endowment. So it doesn't really pay for the entire cost of seeing a performance.
That's very true. And it's also true that the free concerts that we give and this huge array of education programs that the R.P.O. produces every year, of course, that there are many of those programs are free. Occasionally there's a small per child charge of $2 or $5, but of course the cost of producing those programs and just managing what it takes to bring tens of thousands of kids downtown every year to an R.P.O. concert, there's a lot of overhead expense associated with that. Those programs are also supported by grants from foundations and generous individuals in our community.
So it's wonderful that people who can afford to make donations do so, but then you also have individuals who may not be able to afford it, but there are free concerts available as well.
That's right, a lot of free concerts. Every year we have a series of programs, usually in the early fall and the late spring, called Around the Towns, where Michael Butterman, our conductor for education and outreach, will take the orchestra on the road to churches and synagogues and community centers, kind of in all corners. The county, Monroe County, and Maggie Brooks have been very generous in supporting those programs over time. It's very important to her and her staff that we get east side, west side, south side. We get as really the four corners of Monroe County and occasionally beyond. Many people look forward to our annual performance on a Wednesday night on the Wegman series at Ontario Beach every summer. There's always a ball game every year at Frontier Field, followed by an R.P.O. concert. The R.P.O. for many 4th of Julys had been going to Vail, Colorado to a festival, but our participation there is on hiatus for the time being, and so we're now doing a big major concert every year right on the Main Street Bridge.
Which is magnificent. Yeah, it's magnificent with the fireworks afterwards, and it's really
exactly.
Alongside with it, it's really nice. So, what are the trends in expenses? Are you finding that it's getting more expensive to run an orchestra? I mean, of course, there's inflation, but is it becoming more challenging these days? You had to reduce your budget by about $1 million in the past few years. I said, what is the outlook like for managing an orchestra financially?
Well, as you say, we did take $1 million out of the budget in response to the recession, and we're engaged in a very thoughtful strategic planning process, looking forward, and we have no shortage of ideas and aspirations for the future. This past September, we announced Ariel Remerite as our 11th music director. He'll be moving to Rochester with his family this summer and starting on the R.P.O. podium next fall. And believe me, there's no shortage of ideas coming from him. He really dazzled the search committee with his ideas, and since he signed his contract, every day or so we get a call from him with can we do this? How much does it cost? Can we get a funder for that? But the reality is, to be good fiscal stewards of the organization the community has entrusted us to manage. We need to keep our expenses in line with our revenues. So growth over the next number of years will necessarily incremental. The thing I worry about the most is our ability to attract and retain top musicians. You know, as we said earlier, from day one, it was important for George Eastman that when the R.P.O. took the stage, that we were already at a very high level. Mm-hmm. That vision from him and his generosity in our early years, plus this culture of philanthropy that he really advocated in this community, which even to this day results in the 6,000 families supporting us in our annual campaign. I think those two facts, coupled with our historic relationship with the Eastman School, have made it possible for there to be a professional orchestra at a very high level in a relatively small city like Rochester. We're in the top 35 orchestras in the city, or in the country, in terms of our budget size, but yet on any given night, the level of performance, I think most people agree, is comparable to the big city orchestras. That's only true because we're able to attract top musicians. So when someone retires or leaves the orchestra for one reason or another, it's very important for us to be able to replace them with somebody at or beyond the level of their predecessor. And as musician salaries have shrunk over the last couple of years, as we've taken 2 weeks away from the musicians' season, I'm predicting that it will get harder and harder for us to attract top talent. So as soon as we're able to really launch a campaign to address that, well, I'll say it another way. I think it'll be very important for us as we kind of recover from the recession, get our finances stable, that we begin to plan for growth. And I think that would be our first artistic priority, to make sure that we can maintain a world-class orchestra in Rochester, New York.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I mean, you're right. It has to be fiscally responsible, but you have to maintain the artistic quality. And how fortunate it is for Rochester to have such a top-notch Philharmonic in town. So, and then in terms of individuals who can support the R.P.O., they could obviously visit the R.P.O. website, participate in events.
Keep it very simple, rpo.org.
Okay, that's great, .org. And then there's this new book, The Eastman Theater, Fulfilling the George Eastman Dream, which we have here, which they'll show on the screen. With
phenomenal generosity from Betty Strassenberg, a longtime supporter of the R.P.O., we have just published this beautiful coffee table book on the history of the Eastman Theater and the interrelationship between the theater, the school, and the R.P.O. It's filled with magnificent photography, both historic and brand new architectural photography by Andy Olenek, who many people in our audience will remember from his beautiful books for the Landmark Society, New York Landmarks. The author of the book is Betsy Brayer, who many will remember from her many books on regional institutions here in Rochester, but in particular for the incredible book she did a number of years ago on the definitive biography, really, of George Eastman. Right. So she was the perfect person to tell the very special story of the R.P.O., the Eastman School, and our beautiful home, the Eastman Theater.
That's great. Can't wait to read my copy. And Charlie, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nannette Nocon. It's About Money, and stay tuned for our next program coming up in the next month.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you have any questions for It's About Money, please email Nannette at nnocon@aol.com. This program was produced through Penfield Community Television in Penfield, New York.